As a speech-language pathologist and as a multilingual mother of bilingual children, I am finding myself shocked and confused at the number of parents I run into who have chosen not to speak their native language to their children for various reasons, or who have been persuaded to believe that speaking their native language to their children will hurt them socially or academically if the primary language of the community is different. So why should parents talk to their children in their native language? The first and simplest reason is that it is the language in which they are likely to be most dominant or proficient, which in turn is the language in which they are able to provide quality language input as well as support effectively and consistently. Even if a parent is able to pick up the language of the community, that parent's vocabulary, grammar skills, and ease of communication will probably remain stronger in the native language. I've often heard of recommendations from professionals and educators for parents to stop speaking the native language so that confusion is not created, so that language delays won't occur, so that children can do well in school. But the research literature says the exact opposite. The other occurrence that appears to be more prevalent is for the native language to be spoken from birth to preschool, with a sudden shift to the community language once the child enters early intervention programs or school.
When we have droughts, the rings were very narrow, and the more extreme the narrower the ring is, we're trying to identify patterns and widen their wings. You can come to think of that as a barcode in the food that you might buy in the store. Trees in an area you have not exactly the same pattern, but a similar pattern of wide and narrow range, just like that barcode. We get to the point where we can just look across samples. Okay, there's 1580 and there's 1735. We know where those difficult years are. We able to look at the records in the rings, and from that reconstruct streamflow much further back than we can just with historical records in some areas, under the best conditions with the best species we can have, up to 10,000 years record from tree rings. We have maybe 5,200 years historical records from the rivers around here. We have trees and go back several hundred years. If you look at the Weaver River, we have about 100 years of record. The record gives us a rough idea of how long droughts of Benin have severely been, but it's only 100 years record. And the trees been around for 600 or 700 or more years. How can they give us a much longer record of those droughts? Sometimes as we look in the tree rings, we see droughts that are much longer, much more severe than anything we see in the historical record. We've had droughts that have lasted for more than a decade. We had one of the last for 16 years. Water managers can actually incorporate those in the forecast models to help us better prepare for droughts in future. We are excited to be able to take the information and give that water managers now, because they haven't had that for the Wasatch Front before.
When Australians engage in debate about educational quality or equity, they often seem to accept that a country cannot achieve both at the same time. Curriculum reforms intended to improve equity often fail to do so because they increase breadth or differentiation in offerings in a way that increases differences in quality. Further, these differences in quality often reflect differences in students' social backgrounds because the new offerings are typically taken up by relatively disadvantaged students who are not served well them. Evidence from New South Wales will be used to illustrate this point. The need to improve the quality of education is well accepted across OECD and other countries as they seek to strengthen their human capital to underpin their modern, knowledge economies. Improved equity is also important for this purpose, since the demand for high-level skills is widespread and the opportunities for the low-skilled are diminishing. Improved equity in education is also important for social cohesion. There are countries in which the education system seems primarily to reproduce existing social arrangements, conferring privilege where it already exists and denying it where it does not. Even in countries where the diagnosis might be less extreme, the capacity of schooling to build social cohesion is often diminished by the way in which schools separate individuals and groups.
The sound of a cracking knee isn't particularly pleasant, but it gets worse when you listen up close. Knee cracking recording, it does for most people. But for me, it actually just makes me excited. Omer Inan, an electrical engineer at Georgia Tech. I actually feel like there's some real information in them that can be exploited for the purposes of helping people with rehab. Inan's experience with cracking knees goes back to his days as an undergrad at Stanford, where he threw discus. If I had a really hard workout, then the next day, of course, I'd be sore, but I'd also sometimes feel this catching or popping or creaking every now and then in my knee. A few years later, he found himself building tiny microphones at a high-end audio company. So when he got to Georgia Tech and heard the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, wanted better tech for knee injuries, he thought, knee cracking recording, why not strap tiny microphones to people's knees to eavesdrop as their legs bend? What we think it is the cartilage and bone rubbing against each other, the surfaces inside the knee rubbing against each other during those movements. He and a team of physiologists and engineers built a prototype with stretchy athletic tape and a few tiny mics and skin sensors. And preliminary tests on athletes suggest the squishy sounds the device picks up are more erratic and more irregular in an injured knee than in a healthy one, which Inan says might allow patients and doctors to track healing after surgery.
For centuries, boys were top of the class. But these days, that's no longer the case. A new study by the OECD, a club of mostly rich countries, examined how 15-year-old boys and girls performed at reading, mathematics, and science. Boys still score somewhat better at maths, and in science the genders are roughly equal. But when it comes to the students who really struggle, the difference is stark. Boys are 50% more likely than girls to fall short of basic standards in all three areas. Researchers suggest that doing homework set by teachers is linked to better performance in maths, reading, and science. Boys, it appears, spend more of their free time in the virtual world. They are 17% more likely than girls to play collaborative online games than girls every day. They also use the internet more. Third, peer pressure plays a role. A lot of boys decide early on that they are just too cool for school, which means they're more likely to be rowdy in class. Teachers mark them down for this. In anonymous tests, boys perform better. In fact, the gender gap in reading drops by a third when teachers don't know the gender of the pupil they are marking. So what can be done to close this gap? Getting boys to do more homework and cut down on screen time would help. But most of all, abandoning gender stereotypes would benefit all students. Boys in countries with the best schools read much better than girls. And girls in Shanghai excel in mathematics. They outperform boys from anywhere else in the world.